Hi, everyone. FYI, this episode of Silvicast is being recorded virtually. It is a pandemic after all, so please excuse any funky audio issues. You know what I mean. Welcome to Silvicast, the podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Greg Edge.
And I'm Brad Hutnick.
And we are both silviculturists with Wisconsin DNR, Division of Forestry, and your hosts for today's show. And Brad, wait for it, welcome to Season 2 of Silvicast.
Season 2. Inconceivable.
Good job, Vizzini.
Yeah.
But still, here we are for another season.
Well, we got to use a Princess Bride, so this is a good day no matter what, Greg.
A good start. Mm-hmm.
It's a good start. And I'm excited about this season. We've got some great topics planned. And better yet, some of the topics actually came from our listeners, which we really appreciate that.
Exactly, because we want to talk about the silviculture that our foresters and managers are discussing out in the field, not just the stuff that's in our little bubble, Brad.
Well, our bubble might be little, but we get things that come in, and you're going to like this episode. Matt from Rhinelander wants to talk about paper birch and wonders if anyone in the Lake States is regenerating birch fast enough to even sustain this type.
Yeah, there is so much to unpack about paper birch silviculture. Hey, Brad, do you like paper birch?
Yeah, so that's a loaded question, right? Like you ask a silviculturist if they like a tree. So yeah, so okay, what do you mean? Do I like paper birch?
Well, I don't know. Do you like to eat it? I'll go there. You eat everything in the woods, Brad. So
yes, yeah, I'll eat it. And in fact, I'm all about like foraging and doing that stuff. And you may recall us walking through the woods one time looking at a site. We whacked some chaga off the side of a tree with when we could find a stick long enough to reach it. And I've tried the birch syrup. And a certain listener that we both know makes some saisons with different types of birch sap. So it's good stuff.
I never knew what saisons were before.
I still
that
don't.
particular
I still don't.
thing. Actually, those blind taste tests with birch sap beer were really interesting. But we won't go there.
Yeah, we didn't go blind, but it was it was good.
So yeah, I mean, that just emphasizes some of the uses of paper birch, and that always really amazes me. And I think our guests today are going to talk a little bit about that, I'm sure. But for me, and to Matt's point, paper birch regeneration is really a fascinating subject. So here's a factoid, Brad.
I'm ready.
Do you know that in a bumper year, paper birch stand can produce up to 35 million seeds per acre?
Yeah. And I should flippantly say, is that all? Kind of thing. But better question, who actually counts that?
Well, I don't know. Just given my background, I would guess an undergrad probably did something like that.
Yeah. Was there some kind of torture background you had,
Yeah,
Greg,
well,
it's all like
it's all torture.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is a lot of seed, by the way, Brad, by any standards. But all that seed does not a birch tree make necessarily. So paper birch has one of the lowest ratios of growth to volume of all the tree species in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So that's not good outlook for birch.
No, that's discouraging.
Yeah, in fact, the average annual net growth has been negative for over a decade, meaning mortality exceeds growth. So clearly we're kind of losing the battle to sustain birch, at least the paper birch that we've known it.
Yeah,
as we've known it.
So maybe this is a common theme, I guess. Maybe season 2, we're picking up on season 1 because we talked about tree species where the current disturbance regimes really weren't suitable to maintain what we have right now.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, we've talked about it in the past. Paper birch really isn't predicted to be a quote unquote winner under climate change scenarios.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I told you there's just a lot to unpack here with paper birch. So today on Silvicast, we've invited and not one, but two experts to talk about this topic of paper birch. It's the first episode of the season, Brad, so, I thought we should go big and have two guests.
Go big or go home.
So we're going to have our very own colleague and fellow Wisconsin State Silv, Colleen Matula, along with paper birch guru John Zasada. John is a retired forest research scientist with the U.S. Forest Service.
Can't wait. We'll be back in a minute. Today's episode of Silvicast is brought to you by Tree Harmony, the #1 tree dating app, helping you separate ags from Uggs since 2018. Don't be called. Join today.
Boy, we've all been there, haven't we, Brad?
Far too often, Greg.
Throwing on that coal pile of life.
But we both reproduced.
Okay, well, welcome back to Silvicast with our guests, Colleen Matula and John Zasada. So really excited to have these dual competing guests here today. And Colleen, we see you a lot or talk to you a lot, but just for the other people out there, give us a little introduction of yourself.
So my name is Colleen Matula. I work for the DNR. It's been close to 20 years now in the silviculture program. And prior to that, I worked with the Forest Service for 10 years in forestry and ecology. I grew up in Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and it's here where I got a better understanding of birch uses. There's a larger contingency of Finnish heritage there. And I have a lot of Finnish friends. We would take saunas and swat each other with birch.
Yeah, somebody told me about that. I want to know more.
Birch swats. I cannot pronounce it because the language is very difficult to pronounce. But a real important part of their heritage is sauna and birch. So.
Now we're going to get our explicit rating for birch swatting.
Brought one with me.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and truth be told, Colleen is the, if we're, like I always say that DNR silviculture is a three-headed dog, but I think Colleen's the sane head on the dog for this one.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. John, you kind of have a long history of being involved with birch, and tell us a little bit about how you got into all of this and what you've done.
Yeah, well, I grew up just basically right where I'm sitting. Well, not sitting, but a few miles from here. And so I kind of grew up with birch. My dad was a forester, and we used to go out and cut birch firewood. But anyway, so my career started up in Fairbanks, Alaska. Yeah, there are not very many hardwoods up there in the first place, and birch and aspen and balsam poplar are the key ones. So I was around birch a lot, and then after that I moved to Oregon for a while, and then to Wisconsin. I got back into birch a little bit, and now I'm back in Minnesota. And just about 20 years ago, I accidentally took a class at North House Folk School and kind of fell in love with birch bark and the birch tree again. And so I've been fooling around with birch bark almost certainly weekly, if not almost daily, over that time span. And it's been just a whole lot of fun with the people I've met, and the interest and all the various ways of thinking about and using the birch tree. So that's kind of where I'm at still. Yeah.
But John, I've been looking forward to this conversation because I think in forestry, we have research, but then we have experience, and we don't oftentimes have research and experience kind of coming through in the same people. So we get to pick your brain on this stuff. This is going to be really fun.
Well, there's not much brain to pick anymore, but.
No. So let me ask you guys a question, maybe just to start off. So whenever I think of a species, or I think about how we want to manage, at least now when I'm thinking ecologically, we kind of think about, well, how did it work, or how did it respond to disturbance historically? And in your experience, Colleen and John, how did maybe birch work in our pre-settlement environments where maybe disturbance played a bigger role in its perpetuation?
Yeah, well, a lot of people think that paper birch is a fire-dependent species, but it's not really so. It's more opportunistic. So where there's fire, you'll probably see this early successional species occupy these sites, especially when mineral soil is exposed after fire. So you'll see birch, a large component in the pre-settlement conditions, along with pine, red pine and white pine. So it likes disturbance, period. And as many early successional species, they're more opportunistic of these sites.
So since it likes disturbance and just kind of goes where that mineral soil seedbed gets exposed, or it has that seedbed to get started, when we went through the cutover period, we would have had a lot of that type of habitat for birch. So what we see today, is that just kind of a big bubble from that big cutover period? Was there less birch on the landscape prior to that? Just trying to get a feel for kind of what we're seeing today and whether that would have been typical pre-settlement.
Yeah, so pre-settlement conditions, we had less birch, but where we saw birch from that period of time was in areas, like I said, the white pine and the red pine, colonizing patches where there was stand replacing fire. We probably saw bigger patches of white birch because, but largely those early successional species were small, much less than what we see today. And then, of course, after the cutover, and all the disturbance that occurred along with the cutover, we had probably in 1983, we had about 3% of our forest resource in birch as far as acreage goes. So we are kind of phasing out of that big bubble of birch because it's not a long life species, and a lot of mortality we're seeing right now.
I think the same thing's happening here in northern Minnesota. A number of years ago, I was talking with the county guys here, and they said that they had about 5% of their forest stands left in pure birch, and they weren't at that point even doing anything to try and keep it as part. It wasn't a favored or target species at that time. I think a little bit of change has happened though, because I hear them now talking about, can we get birch back? And I think, Colleen, too, wind disturbance gets the soil all churned up too, is probably.
Yep. Fire, wind, and also logging history.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just kind of interesting because we know from our FIA numbers birch is on the decline and we're losing it, and people are obviously concerned about that. But then also trying to consider that with that we're also exiting this bubble from the cutover period. So just some interesting things to think about with it.
Yeah, so maybe it's declining, but maybe that baseline of our decline, like you were saying, Greg, if we were in a big bubble, maybe we come back to a balance at some sort, or we just have to avoid losing it.
So, and another tidbit of information is that we're losing it in all age classes. So by half of what we've seen in 1983's inventory. So largely, I could give some reasons. We need a lot of disturbance. It's a sun-loving species. It likes disturbance. Really, big disturbance on the ground, mixing that mineral soil, and then the important opportunities of seeding and other things. We don't need desiccation. That would cause a lot of mortality. So we need the right conditions to get the birch resource going again. And then a lot of competition is happening by red maple. A lot of our forests are getting older. So
I think another thing that I've noticed, maybe it's not a majority thing, but where you have an aspen birch mix, birch is definitely not a favored species in that situation because it comes back just where it was growing, whereas aspen, of course, spreads out. And I think in terms of that mixture here in Minnesota, especially where aspen is viewed as, a prime species, it comes back bam, and if you get clumps of birch, but it's just where it grew before, not like aspen where, one tree makes 100 little ones all scattered out around it, so it is at a disadvantage that way too.
Yeah, John brings up a good point. We've had a couple of silviculture trials on managing birch, and one trial was because there was a mix of aspen and birch in the stand, a forester actually did a lot of cutting, tending the stand, cutting back the aspen and releasing birch, I think 10 feet around specific dominant birch stems, and it works, but it's very intensive
Yeah.
to do that. So
Yeah, you see that birch in those aspen mixes a lot, but the birch falls behind
Right.
the aspen. So yeah, I guess that was a question of mine too, like the trial you mentioned, Colleen. If your objective is birch in those mixed stands with aspen, can you do release work and really pull the birch through? And what I'm hearing is probably yes, but it's very intensive, and sounds like you probably have to release it to a pretty large degree
yeah,
to keep that aspen competition at
Yeah.
bay.
I think our best opportunities to manage birch, paper birch, is knowing your site, the site quality, the soils, and timing these silviculture activities to a good seed crop. Scarification is a must. You really have to mix that soil during the logging operation, pre or post logging, and be in tune with periods of drought. If you're on very droughty soils, you might want to do a different silviculture method than something like a shelter would. So there is, that would minimize that desiccation.
So maybe in both of your experience, thinking about regeneration and what foresters do to try and regenerate it, what have you seen as the most successful systems for paper birch regeneration?
Most of my experience was up in Alaska, and I mean, it's just the same as here. Without mineral soil, you're looking at, I like to think of seed to seedling ratios. You're thinking of a million birch seeds to get started on a pure organic soil, if you can even get anything started that way, So, and one thing I noticed up there, and I think I've read too, is that paper birch doesn't do as well on pure mineral soil, but it's better with a mix of organic matter and mineral soil. I think that's moisture holding capacity and some other things. Because we had really crude ways of scarifying up there, and where you just kind of do this dip and dive method with a bulldozer, and on the edges of those we got the best regeneration, not in the middle where you had really scalped that mineral soil pretty badly.
So once again, I'm putting a plug in for our silviculture trials directory on the forestry website, the DNR forestry website, and we have many paper birch trials documented there.
Oh.
And foresters have posted these trials, and I've looked at a lot of them. And one of them was, shelterwood, specifically on these droughty soils, but incorporating shelterwood down to about 40% crown closure, because it needs a lot of sun, but yet a little bit of shade and protection of the seedlings, but also incorporating scarification. So a couple of foresters tried a variety of techniques, using a root rake, a dozer with a blade and teeth along the blade, and then anchor chain, and then also another one was called a salmon blade. And the salmon blade is, these large shoes along a straight blade, attached to a bulldozer. And it really mixes that soil and incorporates the coarse woody debris that's needed also to maintain that site. But one other thing is, this one forester did this technique to try to scarify a larger part of the site. So he did crisscrosses of that scarification. So he would go over one time and then crisscross the other. And that proved to be the best technique, is the shelter wood along with salmon blade and crisscrossing the area to get maximum scarification.
Huh.
So
How about seed tree? Have you had any experience with that? Or I know we've had discussion here in Wisconsin about that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up. I I remember a little bit of a debate about one of those intensive forester debates about shelterwood, seed tree,
Yeah.
shelterwood.
So seed tree also can be used, and it's a technique where you're leaving a certain percentage, either individual trees or little patches of trees. You know, in our silviculture handbook, we recommend, 3 to 10 trees that are left after harvest. And, scattered throughout the stand, and you're leaving probably your more dominant, codominant stems that are left on for seed potential. And that works. It's not recommended on those droughty soils, but it can be used on the sandy loam soils. Sure enough, it works very well. But, after a couple of years, those seed trees will die as they are stressed after. But the intention of leaving them is for multiple reasons. One of them for seed, and then also to just fall over and provide coarse woody debris on the ground.
So again, you're saying that consideration of not letting the seed and the seedlings desiccate or dry out is really kind of paramount. So with that seed tray, if you're on a little moisture site, that's going to help that situation, even though your canopy is much more open with the seed tray.
Yeah, those little seedlings, when they germinate, less than 50% of them survive. A lot of them die through desiccation and other measures. So we want to give them a good chance to survive.
So one thing that I used to think about was how long the seed bed remains receptive after site preparation, because a lot of other stuff is going to come back as fast, if not faster, than the birch. If you don't get it maybe that first year or the second year, I think the probability that the seed trees will be of much value goes away really fast, because the seed is tiny. I mean, it's tiny. I was looking up something today, and I think, what is it, 2 million seeds per pound, something like that. So it's tiny seed, and it can get covered up quickly, and so I think that's an issue. And even in the timing of your site preparation, if you can somehow at least crudely predict when the seed crop is going to be, that if you can time it that way, not do your site prep immediately after if it doesn't look like a good seed year, but because every 2 or 3 years, 4 years, you're going to get probably a bumper crop. So
yeah, no, that's a really good point, John, about that small window of trying to match that seed bed with that seed crop, and so timing becomes really important. And I was kind of brings up a question for me, Colleen. In some of those trials, are they scarifying prior to the shelterwood or seed tree cut, or are they doing it after?
So we do see both. With a salmon blade, from what I hear from our forestry technicians, it's easy to operate prior to harvesting with the salmon blade attached to a dozer. So the ability to get around is a little bit easier. With anchor chaining, I see more of that happening post-harvest. That's not as effective.
Have you guys had any experience with, I know there's also been discussion about fire as a silvicultural tool and using it to kind of perpetuate birch. Has there been any work with that here in the Lake States?
I've seen a little bit of it, but birch is very susceptible to mortality when you bring a fire through. So some of the sites that have been documented, we get a lot of top dieback after a fire runs through, and it's just because it's stressed after that fire. So, although a lot of people think it is a fire-related species, it might not be the best for, maintaining that species. So, but maybe prepping the site.
How about where you don't have those seed trees? Have you seen people try things like direct seeding with paper birch?
Yeah, I don't mean to jump in here a lot, but I've seen a couple foresters have direct seeded in, the late fall, early winter. And one forester over in Douglas County seeded in November when there was just a light skiff of snow on the ground. And two things here, he was able to see how the broadcast of the seed was at the site, so he could ensure he's getting covering a lot of area with the direct seeding operation. And then also snow will help facilitate in the spring, more moisture to get the seed to germinate. So yeah, we've had a couple direct seeding projects and they seem to work pretty well.
I think another thing about this is how far birch seed gets dispersed away from the seed source, because a lot of times I've read, or not a lot, but a number of times you read in the literature about over snow dispersal when you get certain, the right conditions. And I wouldn't disagree that that happens, but I don't think that you can count on opening up a great big area and thinking that you're going to get good enough seed dispersal from a quarter of a mile away or something like that. I think you got to have that seed a lot closer than long distance over snow dispersal would get you your result.
Yeah, especially in any kind of quantity, like you mentioned earlier, John, to get a full birch stand.
Yeah.
Yeah, you probably need that source
Yeah,
closer.
I think wind dispersal is about a couple 100 feet from the main seed tree. That's what the studies say.
Yeah.
You'd think it would be closer with such a fine little winged seed, but yeah, I've read that too. It's not maybe quite as far as you think.
Is seed viability an issue in any given year, like for paper birch?
Yeah, yes, the viability is less than 50%, I believe. So yeah, and so those are the things that you got to be concerned about, and that's why it puts out a lot of seed, I imagine.
So I'm going to bring us back kind of full circle where we started talking about just some of the amazing different uses and values behind paper birch. And that's just one thing that always really amazes me about this species and the number of cultures that use this species. So I know, John, you've got a ton of background and worked with lots of different people about their uses of birch. What kind of things stand out to you about this particular species?
Probably the dominant thing that people think about is the bark. It's so different than all the other trees. So, and the bark has such seemingly a long history among the Ojibwe culture and all the northern native cultures. It was used, of the canoe and for covering their shelters and all that sort of thing. And then all of the uses, you can bake in it, you can harvest sap in it, you can just all of those things. So I think when most people think about it, I think that's probably what comes to mind as far as uses. But that barely touches the tip of the iceberg. I don't think there's a part of the tree that somebody hasn't used at some place. Plus things like chaga and other things that are not part of the tree itself, but they invade the tree and affect it in that way too.
Hey, Colleen, I'd like to talk about just a little more modern use that we're seeing with birch. All our foresters are well familiar with setting up timber sales for pulp and lumber and everything with birch, but maybe a little less familiar with what's come on in the last 10 years, and that's the craft industry. And how is that utilizing birch, or what's the desire there? What kind of product are they looking for?
Oh, there's been a very interesting, we're talking about bubbles, right? So there's this big bubble of demand for birch poles and birch saplings. And it's across I know for a fact the 3 states, so Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin for sure, where a lot of warehouse and buyers are set up. They try to employ harvesters and to harvest the products wherever, and then they sell the product to a variety of countries that demand this product for the decorative non-timber forest industry. And it's a huge industry right now, and a lot of it's going to China and other places as well. But if you have seen some of recent weddings, you'll see the decorative wetting threshold with the birch, sapling and fulls.
Yeah, or the table centerpieces, I think I've seen.
Table centerpieces. It is a huge industry. And here in Wisconsin, we've had to regulate it as far as issuing permits on state lands to allow that to be harvested within reason. We have designated areas where people can harvest with a permit.
Yeah, I could definitely see where, from a sustainability standpoint, the challenge is to manage where it's appropriate to harvest that younger birch, because obviously you don't want to cut your regen off before it develops. So
yeah,
I could see where that's a challenge.
Yeah, and it is a money maker. You're not going to pay for your college tuition, but you can get anywhere from $2 for an 8-foot pole. And that's you see semi loads going down the highway to warehouses, and it can be a concern of over harvesting in some areas. So it's something to be aware of. And in Wisconsin here, we've been trying to keep tabs on the harvest.
Colleen, is there discussion about like sustainability guidelines for harvesting that? Like, so it sounds like it's a valuable product, and then the question is, how do you make it sustainable so you can have that product in the long run?
Yeah, we've tossed around some ideas about sustainability, but right now we're just managing the interest out there and focusing them to certain areas where, we would cut the poles anyways to get into a timber sale, logging roads cleared, stuff like that. So I don't know, it's just a product that we haven't wrapped our heads around regenerate or, provide areas. Maybe in the future.
Well, there's one other thing we got to talk about briefly, and that's this sap that comes out of birch trees. Because we in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan are maple syrup snobs, and we miss big time a really, really important liquid, and that's what comes out of birch trees. And if you look worldwide, I don't know if this holds anymore, but probably my guess is birch covers a whole lot more area than the maple does. And I don't know how many millions of gallons a year of birch sap are harvested in Scandinavia and Russia in particular. And it pains me, that we ignore obviously that, it's just a neat part of the tree that gets, ignored, partly because we have maple here. But as you go to Alaska, that's all they got. So, it's not a huge industry up there, but they're doing it, And I guess Scandinavia, the Finns, the Russians, they don't have maples, at least in the far north. And so what do they use? I mean, they harvest the sap. And I think it's been shown that maybe birch sap is much more healthy than maple sap is, because it does have more stuff in it than maple does. That's not to say that. And the other thing is the sugars are totally different. Sugars, I think, in maple are mostly sucrose, and in birch, it's interesting that it's not very first run, part of the run is sucrose, or a lot of sucrose. That tapers off, sucrose is gone, and it's fructose and glucose, I think, simple sugars that become the sweetener in maple. And so you've got, and of course, the big thing is it takes 100 gallons of birch sap to make 1 gallon of birch syrup. And so that's a big deal too. But I just, for people that are into it, that they miss out. I harvest it and I just freeze it and drink it, just straight sap. And
well, we have a friend who's trying to make a dent in using birch sap for beer. So
okay.
Question I've got, several of my neighbors, people you talk to, everybody's into chaga now. And that seems like it's the really hot thing. So what's your familiarity? Is that very common? Do you guys see it frequently? Are there any issues with harvesting that?
I guess I can start out. I'm a skeptic, but I've had, and foresters around Grand Rapids have had lots of inquiries. Somebody will go out in the woods and come back and say, why is those big chunks off those trees out there, and well, that's chaga. And I wouldn't argue at all. The thing that makes me think that there's something to it is that apparently there's a long Ojibwe history with the use of chaga. So, it's not just a bunch of us white folks out there thinking that that's really miracle stuff. I think they do some separation with alcohol to get certain chemicals out of it, as opposed to most of the folks just go out and grind it up and make tea out of it that they can have. And so I've wondered, you're disturbing the tree no matter what you're doing, but what about these two different ways of getting whatever chemicals out of it that you want?
I thought that was the sauna, that part.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. SWAT. Drink a sip of tea, SWAT.
Yeah. But definitely chaga is a big deal. And I think it still is here. And it's throughout the range. I go back to Alaska to visit every few years, and there's all kinds of tinctures and mixtures of chaga with this and that. And I've got a bar of soap that I use every morning, and half of it's white. I don't know what's in that, but the other half is black, and that's got chaga in it.
I think we'd be remiss not to mention the values of wildlife and birch. And I know, Colleen, you had mentioned this. And I have read that moose prefer birch browse, but we're not really in the moose range. But here in Wisconsin, like what is utilizing birch, or what isn't?
Yeah, have you ever chewed on a twig? It's very good. But anyways, so many species utilize birch, from the catkins for food to shelter. A lot of animals use it for shelter. The bird species such as red poles and evening grosbeaks, grouse just love the catkins, and they'll sit down and forage on the catkins and the seeds. Interesting species that you could say it relies on birch is brown creeper. So this is a little tiny bird that spirals up the tree and down the tree, just like nuthatches. But they make a nest, underneath the bark. And I've encountered a couple of their nests before, and it's so cool to see a brown creeper nest. And it's because it's providing protection, and it's a great spot for them. It's kind of like their niche. Other species I've seen, salamanders, they love to nestle under the bark because it's a nice moist spot for them to stay, and it's hidden and dark. And so I've encountered, redback and spotted and blue spotted salamanders under bark, which is on the forest floor. A nice cool spot for them to hang out. So there's just an abundance of wildlife that we can refer to.
And thinking about that importance, so you guys have talked about kind of that historic context, the kind of cultural importance of it, and maybe the wildlife. So one of those challenges maybe going forward might be climate change. What's the forecast or prognosis with climate change?
Well, John, it's going to be a loser, hey? As far as I'm afraid, pretty sad to say, but if we can maintain our birch on some of those ideal spots, it's because of desiccation and drought and this fluctuation of weather patterns, from lots of rain to drought periods. Forest health issues such as insect and disease are flourishing in our, with climate change now, and that can only hinder birch diseases and insect, or encourage them to occur. So I'm a little concerned about birch.
So just kind of pulling this together, these are really just diverse and really great conversation, and I knew it would be with this particular species. And we know that birch in the lake states, it's declining. We have these challenges like we mentioned with climate change. What do you think we should do? I guess both Colleen and John, what do you think we should do moving forward to do our best to try to maintain this species? What should foresters do?
Well, there's obvious things that we can do. I know the foresters that I've spoke with that have a substantial resource of birch comparative to others. Like Douglas County, I hate to call out a county, but yeah, Douglas County has a lot of birch, and they're managing for birch, and they're doing it really well. And so there are areas that we identify that we can regenerate birch, and we should identify those areas and keep going with it, because whatever they're doing over there, they're doing it right. And so there's other areas across the landscape. I know the Northern Highlands ecological landscape has a lot of opportunities for birch, but I think we have to just be a little more aggressive in those scarification techniques, and then go with the silviculture that's appropriate for that area, because you really have to know your site and stand and habitat type and soils and all that stuff. And I think it will be successful, because the trials that we've seen have been successful.
Yep. And Colleen, you mentioned previously, you talked about like some ideal sites for it, and here we talk about maybe sites where you can manage for it. Are there some commonalities that would, if a forester is looking at sites, they might say, oh, this is an ideal site for paper birch?
Yeah, I've talked to some foresters point out areas like that. So that would be the sandy loams with forest habitat types of, the parva and beyond, like, I'm spouting some habitat types that folks might not even know, but yeah, so those sandy loam soils are really good for birch if you have it at the site. And yeah, so, but if you have a lot of competition, and deer love white birch, they'll browse that one for sure. So those are some considerations to think about if you're going to try to manage a stand. So, but it's possible. It's just that we have to identify these sites and just be a little more aggressive with treatment.
Yep.
I think one thing is that we don't write it off. We don't write birch off just because of the climate thing. And I'm not saying that that's not going to happen, but at this point, it's still a fairly successful species. And if we find the right sites, it just brings some nice diversity to our forest landscapes wherever we are.
Yep. Well, I think that really is key, is don't give up on this species. Look for those opportunities. Like you said, Colleen, think about site, and think about like what both of you mentioned today about disturbance and the need for having the right kind of conditions for seedbed and germination and all of that, and we can do it successfully. So I really appreciate both of you coming in today to talk to us, and just kind of maybe just brushing on this subject, because there's a whole lot more we could talk about with these particulars of this species.
Can I promote a book? It's called Celebrating Birch. The Lore, the Art, and Craft of the Ancient Tree. And John is a co-author of many authors in here.
All right.
And you can get it at North House Folk School. Awesome book.
Oh.
Hey, we're all about promoting reading. So, right, Brad?
Yep. Well, and it's always a treat talking to people who are thoughtful and imaginative, thinking about silviculture and kind of the products that we get out of this stuff. So I really appreciate the conversation today.
I appreciate
Thank you,
the
guys.
opportunity. Thanks very much.
Yep.
Thanks, both of you. Take care of yourself.
That music can only mean it's time for the Dropbox. The Dropbox is a regular segment where we take your comments, questions, tips, and share them with our listeners. If you stick something in the Dropbox, it will be received by our fantastic Silvicast editor, Haley Frater. Haley, how do people get to the Dropbox?
Hey, Brad. Listeners can reach us at UW Stevens Point, Wisconsin Forestry Center by emailing wfc@uwsp.edu. Feel free to include a sound file of your question or comment if you like. Your feedback is super important to shaping Silvicast, so please do not hesitate to reach out with a question, topic idea, or any feedback that keeps Greg and Brad in line. I greatly appreciate it. And if you like the episodes, be sure to subscribe.
Well, season 2. I always dreamed we'd be back here.
Those weren't dreams. They were nightmares.
Brad, was that God?
Not. That was the booth.
Oh, the booth.
Oh
Now
boy.
the booth is talking to us.
Season 2.
no.
Watch out. Well, thanks for listening to today's episode of Silvicast. If you have any ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. We learn best when we wrestle with questions, so keep them coming.
Well, that does it, everyone. Take care. And as always, thanks to our team here at Silvicast, Haley Frater, our editor-in-chief, Noah LeMade, our IT master, and theme music by Paul Frater. And of course, thank you to UW Stevens Point, Wisconsin Forestry Center.